And some of the initial decisions of Chinese planners in the immediate period of Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, built round ring roads going around the city, has a horribly American feel from the 1950s and 60s, and makes public transport much more difficult to deliver. If you look at the great Chinese cities, like Shanghai and Beijing, or their equivalents in Mumbai and Delhi, all of them are building underground rail systems of a same scale as London's. And in particular, in Shanghai, they have now, in the space of just 15 years, built an underground network now larger than that existed in London, opening one new underground line on average every year. If you look at the situations around cities that have taken a wrong turn initially, I say Dubai. Dubai decided it wanted to create a great financial centre that would eventually rival New York and London, and believed, largely because of it sits on the greatest concentrations of oil anywhere in the world, that this would be a car-driven situation, and people would move from office to office, do their negotiations by car journeys. And of course, for anyone who's been to Dubai, the traffic is catastrophic. They are now rushing to create a public transport system because that finance and business centre that New York and London have, it needs to be close and tight together so people can get to see each other quickly and easily, and that inevitably means the bulk of those journeys being by public transport. If you're looking at the situation, say, in Mumbai, several dispersed financial districts, so that you can spend half your day wasted in time travelling one to the other. So that's the point I'm trying to make, that perhaps the single most important situation in terms now, as our cities develop, as we modernise them, is to shift the bulk of transport onto public transport or cycling and walking, and away from this sort of 70-year infatuation with everybody having their own car and driving to virtually every journey that they're going to make. Now, that required me to take several decisions which were deeply controversial. For a very long time, the 32 London boroughs, covering about 250,000 people each, had all had their own separate planning rules about density and height. The creation of the mayor office gave the mayor the chance, through the London plan, to standardise this. And I took the view that you should judge each site on its merit. If you have an absolutely world-class building that is a pleasure to look at, then the height is not relevant, it's the quality of the building. If an architect can design homes for many more people, imaginatively good homes, on a site than another architect who sees it as about lots of little rabbit hutches, each with their own little patch of garden, it's what works. And so I abolished all restrictions on density and height. And this allowed immediately, basically, the doubling of the amount of house building in London. But you had to keep the pressure on, and there's a constant struggle with developers who just want to scram the maximum number of very unattractive units onto a site, as opposed to some of the much more imaginative, high-density developments that you see in cities like Amsterdam or Copenhagen. This caused something of a backlash from organisations like English Heritage and so on, who would like to think that you could have a city in which no tall building would ever intrude over an ancient historic one. But the vast majority of people broadly came behind this package of pro-environment, pro-intensification of development, pro-public transport measures. And we got big business, the trade unions, and the Green Party all broadly signed up. All of them, none of them got everything they wanted, but all got enough to say this was a 20-year plan for the development of London that broadly everybody could rally behind. When we came to looking at the problem of transport in London, we had had decades of neglect of investment. So our underground railway, there were actually occasions when, as equipment failed, there was no replacement commercially available. There had times when we went to transport museums to find the equipment to replace what had failed in our underground. And we are now in this deadly race that we're renewing the signalling, the track, the trains. My successors carried this work on as rapidly as we can before the system fails. And we are only just running ahead of it. just had a series of problems over the last couple of weeks. The closure of the line again and again. Actually, on the line on which I live, the Jubilee line, people turn up to go to work, the system's down because the signalling's failed. It is a desperate race because of that lack of investment in the past. And particularly modernising an underground is the work of a decade or more. And you had to move rapidly to do something about transport. And if we were going to introduce a congestion charge and force people to leave their cars at home, you had to provide an alternative. Otherwise, you most likely wouldn't be safe to walk on the streets. And so we went for the bus option. You can buy new buses quickly, you can put bus priority lanes in quickly, you can hold the fares down to make it more attractive. So as we planned the congestion charge, we went about a transformation of our bus system. 5,500 old buses were replaced by 8,000 new ones. We held the fares for 4 years, so it became more attractive. A system that had basically been for the poorest became one that all classes started to use again. And the introduction of bus priority lanes and the congestion charge meant that bus journeys became quicker and more reliable. So that over 8 years, we went from 4 million passenger journeys a day to 6 million, which is a dramatic transformation. I have to say, it was costing us £500 million a year, but the alternative would have been a gridlock city. The congestion charge was not some great socialist plan, as many of my conservative opponents argued. We stole the idea from Milton Friedman. It's one of only 2 ideas he came up with that Mrs. Thatcher wasn't in love with. The other one, of course, was the legalization of all drugs. But in 1952, he wrote a paper saying that, because already the scale of traffic congestion in America was intolerable, that in America, or anywhere around the world, it would be better to have a pricing mechanism rather than actually controlling road space by congestion. And we took that, a fairly crude system, computer just reading people's number plates, checking them against the national car database register, not the sort of transponder scheme that there is in New York for toll roads and so on. But it worked. I never had any doubt it would work. Technically, it was quite simple. The only issue was it politically possible to do it and survive? The mayor of Paris, a good friend of mine, watched this with interest, and he was fairly certain that the mayor of Paris wouldn't survive doing that. There'd be burning cars in the streets and so on. But the English were very disciplined, we very seldom riot, and it came in and it worked. I have to say, in the face of almost total opposition from the media. The Financial Times, aware of the impact of congestion on business, was on board. The Guardian and the Independent, the liberal papers. But the rest of the media was uniquely hostile. They all predicted it would be a disaster. They all said it would be catastrophic when it came in. As an absolute drumbeat. And every newspaper editor decided the story in the 2-year run-up would be reported by the motoring correspondent, not the environmental correspondent, the motoring correspondent. So people who often prefer the company of their car to the company of their lover were actually reporting what they saw as the greatest infringement that you could possibly have on their way of life. And simply because the negative publicity had been so bad, when it came in and it worked, there was opposition collapsed. My opinion poll ratings went up by 10%, and I coasted to an easy re-election the following year. The IT worked, and it worked because we had huge concentration on the detail of it. And if I give an example of this, it was a sort of, I don't know what your newspapers are like, but our popular press are hostile and negative to virtually all change. When they weren't denouncing the congestion charge, the Daily Mail, which is perhaps the worst of our papers, and unfortunately, I think the second largest circulation, moved seamlessly on from denouncing the congestion charge to a vicious campaign against energy-efficient light bulbs, as though these were going to diminish the English way of life. The other thing we had to do is, if you're doing all this, it's best to have a ticketing system that works well. And once again, our Oyster card system just allowed people to use the system without having to queue for tickets, a card which would automatically charge you the lowest fare, and so on. So all of that was working terribly well, and we started to get a shift. If transport planners talk about transport mode, and 100% of all journeys, including by walking. And when I became mayor, 46% of all journeys in London were by car, and 15% by bus. What we then had was a shift overall, so that car journeys came down to 43%, bus journeys went up to 18%, cycling journeys went from 1% to 2%. And that sounds small, but it's the biggest shift from car usage to public transport in any city in history. And you don't need to stop everybody driving, you just need to reduce the volume, and then the system works. Whilst we were doing this, we were also pressing ahead with that long-term strategy, new rail lines, replicating Paris's very deep rail system that runs straight through the city. After years, 40 years of debate and 7 years campaigning on my part as mayor, we got the outgoing Labour government signed up to build Crossrail, twice the capacity of any existing tube line, and the incoming government has carried on with that. But it's still only the first of what should be 3 lines. And one of my problems with all of this, and I don't know, this may have no application here in Norway, our civil servants are the most unadventurous individuals I know. And almost their approach to projects borders on the malignant. Every single transport project I presented to ministers, the transport civil servants would oppose. They opposed everything. And it gradually occurred to me the problem here was that given that they're not as industrious as they should be, they knew that almost any transport project will go over budget and be late, and there'll be complaints and there'll be an inquiry. So they developed basically this habitual approach. It's best to do nothing than do something that people get complain about, even if it works in the long term. So they rigged all the terms of debate. When you looked at their cost-benefit analysis of every new line, it was always half what the line eventually turned out to have as a cost-benefit when it actually opened. 100% difference between their prediction, and this skewed massively the chance of winning support for any of these things. Then they had another advantage, which, and I don't know how your parliamentary system works here, but there's a huge turnover of ministers in the British political system. If a person is a minister for 3 years in the same post, this is about the maximum you get. Very often it's 2 years. And so some posts turn over. Tony Blair developed it as a fine art. I think John Reid had about 8 posts in 9 years, all in cabinet or something. But the worst example was the Department of Transport. We had 27 transport ministers, 20 transport ministers in 23 years. And this was a situation. I would spend a year persuading a transport minister to perhaps overcome their officials and agree to build the East London line, and then they'd be gone, and I'd have to start again. And I'd go through exactly the same debates with the same officials, whilst the minister sat there, nervous about, shall I ignore my officials? So we got there eventually, slowly, by bludgeoning them into the ground. But I think the advantage I had was the mayoral system in London was not based on the traditional British civil service system. It is based on the American elected executive politician. So I didn't have a civil service. I had no Sir Humphrey trying to block me. I was the executive. So that when we took over the underground, we were able to remove 27 of the senior managers out of the top 30 in the first year. No minister in Britain ever gets to hire and fire their staff in that way. And that helped to concentrate thinking in developing and driving our programme forward.